everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective. Today, we're talking about common things which I think people probably don't really understand about the conflict in Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Gaza. And essentially, this is drawn from my conversations with people kind of my own age, who I think hear some of these things spoken about and kind of are maybe a bit afraid to ask what they are, out of a fear of seeming stupid or uninformed in some way. But these are things which are basically basic ideas or events in history or people which I think you need to know about to have a basic kind of conversant understanding of the conflict and the history of it and what's going on. And because of that, we have our in-house historian, James, with me. So thank you very much for joining me, James.
Nice. Peter.
Yeah. So the first thing I think we should talk about is the idea of intifada. So I don't know if you saw this, but on the streets in London the last few days, there were people who, although there's been kind of pro-Israel chants in London or protests in the last few weeks, in the last few days, there were people who were walking through the streets chanting from London to Gaza, victory to the Intifada. This has caused a lot of headlines, but I think a lot of people, to be honest, won't really know what an Intifada is or the history around the first and second Intifada. So do you want to introduce this idea? What are they talking about when they say victory to the Intifada?
Attacks by Israel's enemies in order to thwart peace with Israel. It is not resistant. See, the idea that people have in their head, in the early 1970s, there was a set of attacks, frankly, the local Palestinians ranged everything from throwing rocks at police officers to throwing Molotov cocktails and things more violent. But it was a outbreak of violence on the part of Muslim radicals who object to Israel's existence. Now, there's a wider context, historical context that needs to be understood. When Israel was created in 1948, of course, their Arab Muslim neighbors all attacked them. That caused an expansion of Israel, a small expansion territorially of Israel. In 1960, in the late 1960s, there was actually an all-out war that was launched by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt against Israel in order to destroy Israel. This is attack now number 2 on Israel, in a sense, in effect, by all of its neighbors. Now, it only took a few days to deal with, and in the course of a few days, Israel took over the whole of the West Bank and all of the Sinai Peninsula. In the course of that. Now, as history would show, Israel, by the late 1970s, Israel had demonstrated its willingness actually to give up Sinai altogether, which it gave back to Egypt, its territorial gains in the war it had in the late 60s. So these occupied lands were, in Israel's mind, open to some kind of negotiation. But the fact in the early 1970s that people were beginning to think, okay, well, now we need a permanent settlement of the issue. We need a permanent diplomatic solution. That's what set off regional violence in the West Bank against Israel. They did not want peace. They did not want a permanent state of Israel, and that's what launched the violence. 20 years later, an even more serious set of violence than the second Intifada occurred. And again, the idea by this point now, there's active negotiations. We'll get into some of this later stuff, things like the Oslo Accords and so forth. There were diplomatic efforts by this point to get the PLO and Yasser Arafat to make peace with Israel, and international parties were actively involved in trying to get such an agreement based on the agreement that Egypt and Israel had worked out in the late 70s, whereby Egypt got the Sinai Peninsula back. They hoped that they could do the same on the West Bank. And there was in fact, there were Oslo Accords, diplomatic accords. Scandinavian nations were very active in this for some reason. But in any event, there were these Oslo Accords that said, well, look, if we can go back to the original 1967 borders, at least in theory, and if the Palestinians would recognize Israel's right to exist, at least in theory, we have the framework for an agreement. It was that idea that they would come to peace that launched a whole bunch of violence against Israel. So when we mean intifada, what we mean are the violent activities by Palestinian radicals to attempt to wipe out Israel and to scuttle any attempt at a permanent peace solution. That's what it means.
Yes, absolutely. So intifada itself is derived from an Arabic word. It means something like uprising or struggle. I think the root of the noun is something like shaking off, something like so, kind of resistance. It's got that kind of connotation. And the first intifada, the dates for it are a little hazy because it's not. It's a kind of it's referring to a generalized period, but generally people think about it as starting in the late 80s in 1987, and then ending in the early 90s. Some place it around 1991, and some place it with ending with the Oslo Accords in 1993. And as you say, the Intifada is armed resistance. So some people who I think are kind of apologetic about the Intifadas refer to the first Intifada as being informed by ideas of non-violent resistance and so on. And perhaps there was some suggestion of that, maybe, but at the beginning. But anyone who looks at the first Intifada very quickly, if that were a present idea, that goes away very quick.
Right.
Lots of attacks on the Israeli military, use of Molotov cocktails, things like that, and so on. And then by the time you get to the second Intifada, no one is kind of holds that pretense anymore, if they ever did. You see suicide bombings,
murders, and it was an expansion of it. The second Intifada was really a much more violent thing, and the irony here again is that any attempts at self-defense on the part of Israelis are regarded as hostile aggression. Remember that the West Bank and Sinai were taken as a matter of self-defense. These had been used as launching pads by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt in a coordinated war against Israel to destroy them. The occupation of the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and Sinai Peninsula were all a matter of self-defense. And now it's true that there's new Israeli settlements there that are starting to happen. There's new Israeli quote occupation in a sense, because what they're doing is trying to defend themselves against ever having to face an attack. Now, if you think about it, the Golan Heights are a strategically powerful position from which to attack Israel. The West Bank is forever, constantly a place where you could attack just about anywhere in Israel. Again, and from the south, Gaza and Sinai. The occupation of these lands initially was an act of pure self-defense. And by sending Israelis in, I mean, frankly, honestly, Israel should have just taken these areas for their permanent security, because they've been used aggressively against the very existence of Israel. In theory, Yasser Arafat had agreed to the framework that would recognize Israel. And during the 1990s, following the Second Intifada, Bill Clinton and other international forces tried to get Yasser Arafat and Israel to make peace once again. And that was a giant failure. And although Yasser Arafat had agreed to a framework which might result in the recognition of Israel, he never really did. Despite things that American diplomats like John Kerry at the time were saying, actually Yasser Arafat never recognized Israel's right to exist. He refused to participate in any final agreement about the West Bank, precisely because he refused to recognize Israel's very right to exist.
Absolutely. And basically all of the things I think we're going to be talking about on today's episode are interlinked. So we've covered a few of them slightly already. So that's the idea of Intifada. So when the people in London are walking through the streets shouting from London to Gaza, victory to the Intifada, or globalize the Intifada, as it's sometimes put, particularly if you think about globalize the Intifada, what they're talking about is a global armed resistance to Israel, if you want to put it generously, but also there's strong kind of anti-Semitic connotations as well. So that's Intifada. And so then the second one I wanted to cover, which we've kind of gone over a little bit as well, is the 1967 borders. And so all of these, like I said, are things which I think get mentioned and people aren't too sure about them. And I think where the 67 borders get brought up is when people are commentating on the news and so on, who are generally pro-Palestine or so on and so forth. They'll say things like, if we could only return to the pre-1967 borders or something like that, then I would think that was fine. Or that would be a more equitable solution to the situation, right? So they have some objection, as you said, to them taking the Golan Heights to the West Bank and to Gaza, right? Right. And I view that basically as not even a serious position. That, like, the people who are advocating in favor of the Palestinian cause, Hamas, whoever, actually think if Israel just gave up the land that was taken in 1967, they would think that was fine. But so, like you said, so these areas were taken out of self-defense. So the Golan Heights, as I understand it, were taken because artillery installations were used in the Golan Heights, which were very effective from that area. I think,
and killing civilians too, repeatedly killing civilians. We're not talking just, I mean, I mentioned two big wars. One when Israel first got founded, and then one in the late 60s where Syria, Jordan, and Egypt get together to try and wipe out Israel. It's not just those two big attacks. There's constant attacks going on in the interim and since and after that. And there's this constant violence that's coming from the West Bank and the Golan Heights and from Gaza. I mean, even unto this day, when Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip, what have we seen for the last 15 years? I mean, within a month of taking over their management of Gaza, they're lobbing rockets into civilian areas of Israel. And this is the state of affairs that's going on. If you were simply to return to the 1967 borders, which is the stated ideal of theirs, what they're asking for is return to this position where we have a knife against Israel's throat once more and can wield it. And so a simple-minded return to that would be to ignore Israel's security interest. It would be to ignore the aggressive attacks that Israel has repeatedly faced from these areas. So until that's addressed, the idea of returning to the 1967 borders is simply an anti-Israel. Let's have multiple more shots at destroying Israel like we have repeatedly in the past. It is an ignoring of Israel's security concerns that led them to take the West Bank and the Golan Heights. Until those security concerns are fully addressed, how can we expect Israel ever to participate in a negotiated settlement? It's an all one-sided thing. If we have to return to 67 without addressing Israel's security concerns, we're asking for the destruction of Israel, in effect.
Yeah, and part of the reason why this came up a lot in the last few years, the idea of let's return to the pre-1967 borders, at least in the UK and where I kind of heard it. And to give some personal context on this, part of the reason why I think people end up confused about these things is because this conflict has been going on so long, longer than most people who are watching this channel would have been alive, pretty much everyone really. And I remember really only, I would hear about the conflict when I was growing up and you'd hear these things thrown around, but I only actually really, I think, set myself the task of learning about it and learning about these things really when the conflict broke out again in 2021. And I would have been 23. And I think, and prior to that, I remember hearing things like this and not really knowing what they were. And I think it's a good thing to explicate some of these ideas. So, and maybe it would have been better for me to organize this chronologically, because we're going to take another jump back in time now. So another word which I would hear thrown around is Nakba. And particularly you hear this thrown around by people.
Evil Israelis who have just been forcefully occupying these new lands. As I've tried, the term mostly refers to the Israeli oppression and violence of the late 40s. You can see it was as I say, what they call violent assaults and oppression and a dispossession, land taken from us, violence against us. Well, that's what the word basically means. And they usually mean like in the late 40s. But as I say, it's actually what they're complaining about is Israeli self-defensive actions. Whether it was in the late 40s, the late 60s, the early 70s, the early 90s, again and again and again, what we're talking about is denouncing Israel for any attempt at defending itself. Now, when you defend yourself, sometimes that means, well, yeah, you kill people because they attacked you. And when you defend yourself, yeah, that sometimes means you have to occupy certain areas that were used to stage attacks against you. If you regard any such self-defensive actions as themselves aggression, the slaughter of Palestinian people, the dispossession of Palestinian people from their lands, what you're complaining about are self-defensive actions that would never have been necessary had you not launched aggressive wars against Israel in the late 40s and the late 60s, and then continued the violence in the early 70s and the late 80s and early 90s, and even to this day, as I say, with Hamas and Hezbollah rockets. It just hasn't stopped. And anything Israel does, for example, the partial occupation that's now occurring because in their response to Gaza, that's more of this terrible Israeli violence against innocent Palestinians, more Israeli stealing of Palestinian land, don't you know? And so it will get this term. It's a generalized slur term for Israeli so-called oppression of the local peoples.
Yeah, and so literally, what Nakba means in Arabic supposedly is catastrophe. So when people refer, yeah, and so when people refer to the Nakba, they're referring to the catastrophe, right? And these are the events, as you say, of the late 40s, particularly of 1948. And should we? And so should we just?
Israel is the ultimate Nakba for them. As such, the advent of the nation of Israel is really what they regard as the catastrophe, the calamity through which we must all react. Yes.
So and so, because you get this kind of vagueness around Nakba about what exactly it's referring to, and sometimes it's meant to refer quite narrowly to, in a sense, the aftermath of the war when people were displaced from villages and things like that. But then, really, what you also get is what you're referring to, which is the whole founding of the state of Israel.
I think that's what they really mean at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so should we provide some context on that as well? Then, so how was the state founded? And so we have the British mandate in Palestine and so on. Should we talk a bit about, so how does this come about? How does the Nakba come to be?
Well, well, it's a complex history. Of course, Jews have always been in the area, but the historical reality is that from the middle of the 19th century forward, there's been massive Jewish immigration. What they, in their own ethnic and religious terms, call as a return to Jerusalem, and they have their own religious reasons for it. But the fact of the matter is that throughout the Muslim and Christian worlds, Jews had been a persecuted minority. I think this goes without saying, and I don't think this requires a big history lesson. Christian Europeans there had been pogroms and expulsions and genocides, climaxing in the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century. In the Muslim world, my God, I mean, if it was on a different scale, it was because these were less civilized and technologically advanced areas. But there's all kinds of anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, ghettoization in various Muslim places in the Muslim world. And so a movement of Zionism to create a state where Jews could be safe and have their own state. Finally, and where are Jews indigenous from? At the end of the day, in effect, but much of the land was being purchased by in what is Israel today, and even the West Bank, where a lot of it was being privately purchased by wealthy Jewish interests in Europe, so that it could be a homeland for Israel. Now, the Ottoman Empire had controlled the region for centuries, and it had oppressed the regional minorities there, including the Arab Muslims. The Turkish Muslims, the Sultan was himself oppressing a giant empire that in part included Muslims, such as the Arab Muslims. So when in World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses, falls apart, we create the aftermath creates independent Arab states liberated from their Turkish oppressors. That's what Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab Revolt was in effect all about, even if it meant drawing artificially straight lines between Iraq and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. The indigenous Arab peoples got their own independent states, even if they were largely royalist, theocratic. The Jews did not get. They were the one group that did not get a state when the Ottoman Empire was broken up. And the British basically controlled things for good or evil, until after World War II. And after World War II and the Holocaust, this desire for a Jewish state becomes all the more pressing after the Holocaust. But Jews have always been there. Jews have been migrating there for a long time. I find it so ironic, as I've said, that people who want advocate for open immigration to the United States or Muslim immigration to Europe find it terribly objectionable that Jews have been immigrating to that area. They don't get to migrate, you see. That's wrong for them to be able to move about from safer to a safer place, from places where they had been persecuted. Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Jews have been migrating there. So for safety purposes, mind you. But of course, as objectivists, we realize the objectivity, the validity, the moral validity of a state depends upon its recognition and enforcement of individual rights. And by that standard, from its very inception, Israel was really the only morally legitimate state in the Middle East. If you compare it to, say, the kingdom that Egypt still was, or the kingdom Saudi Arabia still was, basically religiously dominated kingdoms, Israel was really the only valid modern state in the area in the late 1940s. So that's what led to the creation of Israel, and a state that respects individual rights and brought modernity to the region in a substantial way.
Yes, absolutely. Another key figure, I hadn't put this guy on my list, but I think he's relevant as well because he comes up is Theodore Herzel. So I think he's relevant to some extent as well. So Herzel is, a successful kind of playwright, intellectual figure, man of letters in Vienna in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You can go find pictures of him online. He's a very, very striking figure, big black beard, right? And who becomes a leader of the Zionist movement for a Jewish homeland. And he writes this paper called the Jewish State, or the Judenstaat, something like that. And he kind of ignites a big movement for founding a homeland for Jews in Europe. He kind of sees where the wind is blowing, so to speak, with rising anti-Semitism, and he thinks that there needs to be a country in which Jews can be safe because they aren't the persecuted minority. And he's obviously, given what we know of the history, very foresightful in that sense. And at one point, the idea is that it's going to be founded in Sudan and various places like that, and so on. And eventually, what kind of his efforts lead to is a commitment by the British state in 1917 to help found a Jewish homeland, which is the Balfour Declaration. It's sometimes pointed out that the British authorities at that time didn't exactly do that out of philo-Semitism, sometimes out of anti-Semitic motivations as well. So it's not exactly an amazing thing, the Balfour Declaration, but it's a commitment by the British to helping found a Jewish homeland. And then, as you say, what we get after World War I, as the Ottoman Empire is broken up, is a British mandate over the area. And Lawrence of Arabia is greatly involved in this, and he's a big hero of mine. I've got his 7 Pillars of Wisdom behind me over there.
Oh, what a great read it is. I recommend everyone read the Pillars of Wisdom. It's a fantastic read.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure. So he kind of provides his kind of, I guess, history of the Arabs in the First World War, but also you get some of his peculiar psychology coming through as well.
Yes, and, fascinating.
Yeah, and you can still find lots of the first editions around, actually, which are very beautiful. Anyway, so that's going on, and he is helping the Arab cause, King Faisal, and he ultimately ends up, in a sense, betraying them in that sense, or the British state does with the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
That's a complex issue. Did he betray them and lie to them? Did the government manipulate T.E. Lawrence? You have to ask yourself what all is going on. But European, that's another issue, for another day, I suppose.
Sure. Anyway, we're getting in the weeds there. But so the British end up having control of the area, and as you say, with Herzel's work and the renewed vigor for a Jewish homeland, what you see is large immigration to the area. And then this is where my own knowledge actually is slightly more hazy. I think in the 20s and 30s, what you see is growing civil conflict in the area. I think presumably driven by anti-Semitic sentiment, not really people who are living in the area not really liking that Jews are moving there. And this is something which the British authorities don't really manage to control or contain or put down. And that, I think, is basically why then after the Second World War, after the Holocaust comes to light, that's what motivates the UN to commit themselves to the two-state solution. So to create a Jewish state and then Arab state in the area. And so that is as everything we've said there is, in a sense, the lead up to the Nakba, to ultimately the founding of Israel. Anything else to say on that before we go on to the next one?
I would just remind people of this migration to Israel that's going on. People had been attempting to flee Nazi and fascist Europe in the 1930s and were often sent home or left at sea. And America and Great Britain, I think, felt some earned guilt because during the 1930s, Britain and the United States wasn't particularly friendly to Jewish migration, which was happening for survival reasons. And so America and Britain, I think, after Britain abstained. They didn't even vote for Israel positively, but they did abstain. But I think there was a feeling in the English-speaking world that we had not done enough to protect fleeing Jewish immigrants. And so after World War II, when you've got these immigrants who are on ships waiting to get there and being prevented by the British mandate or by local Arabs from landing and settling there in Israel, it becomes a sort of an emotional cause that dramatically, I think, enhances the plight, the international plight of Jews at the time. Lost at sea, unable to find any homeland, unwelcome anywhere. How long does that have to go on? Where Jews are simply literally sometimes adrift at sea with nowhere to go. And that sort of sets this context. And I think it's an important one.
Absolutely. And there's, I think that national guilt to some extent lives on. So there was, there's a chap called Nicholas Winton, who I don't know if he's very well known internationally, but he's very well known in Britain in the last few decades. Because Nicholas Winton was very much involved in the Kinder transport. So whereas Britain largely defaulted on it, on helping the Jews escape the Germans, right? Nicholas Winton was a young guy of Jewish ancestry who was a stockbroker in Britain, who went over and organized the escape of lots of Jewish children from the Nazis. And the incredible thing about Nicholas Winton was, in a sense, that he kept that secret for decades and decades and decades. And I think it only actually came out, if I'm getting it right, because his wife went into their attic and found some documentation which referred to it and then asked him what it was about. So I want to say that came out in the late 90s. And what you see, obviously, with Nicholas Winton is this huge celebration of the guy because he did this incredible thing, and then people kind of revere it as very, very humble because he kept it to himself. And there's some very moving videos on YouTube of after it's come out, he's interviewed on television in a live studio audience, and the interviewer says the woman sat next to you is actually one of the children that you rescued, and which is this lovely moment. And then she says, "Would anyone else in the audience who was saved by Nicholas Winton please stand up?" And the whole audience stands up, and they were the children he saved. Right? It's this wonderful moment. But the reason I'm bringing that up is Britain nowadays pats itself on the back for his actions, in a sense, for Nicholas Winton, and I think that's motivated by some of the guilt that you're talking about.
The truth is, the British and American governments turned their back on Jewish refugees when it mattered most.
Yeah. So then, I know, let's just do the super chat. So we've got $1 from Bonnie. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And then she asked, why did Britain end the mandate and leave the area in 1947? Did the UN play a part after Britain left or before?
UN really didn't come into existence till after World War II. So there's no United Nations at all. And the League of Nations, its mother organization, had long since collapsed before the outbreak of World War II. So in that period, there is no real active international body, and the UN only comes into existence shortly before Israel comes into existence, Bonnie.
And then we've got $10 from Wes Anderson as well. Thank you very much, Wes. Okay, so then the next one, the fourth one out of this 5 things I think people hear about, we've mentioned briefly, which is Yasser Arafat. So let's provide some context. Arafat's no longer alive, but he's someone who still often has his name brought up if you ever have a look at the history of the conflict. So he's a kind of influential figure. Who is Yasser Arafat, and why do people bring him up?
He was a guy who was engaged. We've covered some of the violence here since the advent of Israel. Well, he is one of these people who was engaged in violence. He was one of the leaders of the violence against Israel. He was out there killing Jews for much of his life. And yet he has the reputation, because he was elected sort of by consensus, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, that was the organization known at the time, before there was a Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And you can just tell from the very name of it, it's sort of this Marxist, Islamicist fusion, led by a man who himself was busy killing Jews for much of his life. And he, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization for, I don't know how many decades, but much of my life, he was the leader of this thing called the PLO. Up to the day of his death, he refused actually to recognize Israel's right to exist. On more than one occasion, on 2 occasions in my own lifetime that I remember, Mr. Yasser Arafat, most distinctly, for example, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton, the President of the United States, thought he'd worked out an agreement between Israel and the PLO, only to have Yasser Arafat sort of give him the fingers and say, no, sorry, Israel and America, I'm not going to recognize Israel's right to exist. So this is a man who had a history of being involved in much of the violence that we've just covered against Israel, a leader of it, made the leader of this group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which from the 70s through the 1990s was doing most of the negotiation for the Palestinian side. And he repeatedly refused peace with Israel, refusing to recognize its right to exist, up to the day he died.
Yes, so I just checked it. So he was chairman of the PLO, it's saying from 1969 to 2004. So a huge length of time he's dominating a lot of the conflict that's going on.
70s and the 90s, he's their voice.
Yeah. He's also one of the co-founders of Fatah, which is
considered the moderate. Exactly. They're the fathers of the Palestinian Authority now that is thought to be the moderate voice there. But of course, they are violent. They're just terrorism light, as we've covered. And Yasser Arafat, their leader for decades, never recognized Israel's right to exist, and himself was a leader of and a participant of violence against Israel and Jews.
Yes. And so, as you said, Bill Clinton is someone who gets very involved in this, and as he got involved in the island peace process and so on, that's something he liked to kind of do. And he also facilitated Arafat meeting the Israeli politician whose name I'm completely forgetting now, who there was this kind of story that that Arafat and this guy had become friends. Do you remember who I'm thinking about? I think it was the Israeli prime minister at the time. But so like, do you know who I'm talking about?
I'm drawing a blank myself with what you're going. Maybe the story that just all jog it in my head.
There's this picture of them with Clinton kind of behind them with hands on their shoulders, right, and Arafat shaking hands with, I think it's the Israeli prime minister. And there's these stories about Arafat supposedly going around the Israeli politician's house and then becoming kind of friends and so on, and people seeing this as kind of a symbol for reconciliation of the conflict, and it's something that's very 90s in its sentiment in my mind. And of course, it doesn't actually lead anywhere. Arafat dies in 2004. The conflict goes on and is as bad as it's ever been in many ways. So, but that's who Arafat is.
American presidents on the left have always had this naive notion that somehow it's simply everyone wants peace at the end of the day. All we have to do is work it out. Well, under Jimmy Carter, the Democrat president of the United States in the late 70s, he actually helped achieve peace between Israel and Egypt. That had to do with the men involved, it seems to me, especially the president of Egypt at the time, Mr. Sadat, more than anything. Bill Clinton, the next Democrat president on the scene, he tries to create peace, but it blows up in his face. And then you'll notice the more recent Democrat presidents, Obama and Biden, have been trying desperately to create peace with Iran so as to bring general peace to the area. And both of these last two attempts have been extremely naive, counterproductive, and have actually led to the problems that we face today, it seems to me.
Yes. Daniel's telling me that it's Yitzhak Rabin is the name, the fifth prime minister of Israel.
Rabin, that's the guy.
That's the guy. So that's Yasser Arafat. And then the final one is that we've covered slightly already, but as well, which is the Oslo Accords. So let's make sure we go over that. So what are the Oslo Accords? Why do they happen? And part of the reason why I think they're important is I always hear the Oslo Accords brought up in a sense as what set the tone for the modern, I don't know, almost form of the peace resolution that's taking place, right? So politicians like Tony Blair and David Cameron, so leaders of Britain in the recent decades, very much, as I understand it, take the Oslo Accords as their kind of guiding light in how they want to see things go.
Well, it created a framework, as I say. It was the desired framework for the parameters of a peace deal. If we go back, and Israel should never have agreed to this in the first place. If we go back to the 67 borders and the Palestinians recognize Israel, then let's have peace. But those are the goals. The Palestinians never recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel couldn't, for its own security purposes, give back those lands. That, as a framework, was doomed to disaster because it neither addressed Israel's security concerns nor did it actually require the Palestinians to recognize Israel's right to exist. And yet, there is this UN created framework. As I say, Scandinavian diplomats seem to be the architect of so much of the desire for peace here. But in any event, it was a UN approved framework for negotiation, which set out goals, but goals that were never achieved. These goals that Israel should never have even agreed to as a framework for peace, because it doesn't adequately address their security interests. And of course, it never required upfront any Palestinian group to recognize Israel's right to exist. So I think the Oslo Accords are actually a corruption. Israel should never have agreed to them. They do not adequately address Israel's security concerns. And to date, we still don't have any Palestinians groups recognizing Israel's right to exist. So as a framework, it was ridiculous. Nothing short of ridiculous in my mind. To use it as a moral ideal is still quite naive in my view.
Yeah, and so as I said, it's the Oslo Accords are very much something that I hear British leaders in recent years bringing up in a sense as their guiding ideal, as you put it. So, and even some contemporary politicians who, you know, Cameron, even though he's come back as foreign secretary, he's had his time as leader, and Tony Blair is not really on the scene anymore. But even contemporary British leaders will refer to the Oslo Accords essentially because this was a major kind of event in the conflict that happened when they were young men and women who were coming into the early stage of their political career. And I think essentially what the Accords did for them was, as you said, kind of set the goal for how do we resolve this thing, and we should always aim for the Oslo Accords. And I think it's the cause of at least some of the misguided perspective that Western leaders have on how we should do it.
A lot of American media figures and academic figures still say Oslo Accords as if it's as if it's a realistic framework, as if we don't require Palestinians to recognize Israel up front, as if we don't absolutely need to address the vital security concerns of Israel, given the fact that the West Bank is used as a staging ground for continuous attacks. I don't think Israel should even recognize that as a goal, frankly. In fact, if there ever is to be a negotiated settlement, seem a bit naive. But if there ever really is to be a negotiated settlement, it cannot be on the basis of the Oslo Accords. Full stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I don't have too much to say about any of these. And something that I want to hit just from people who are watching. Let us know if talking about these things is useful, because it's my impression that a lot of people don't really know, like the things we just spoke about, Intifada, the 67 borders, Nakba, Arafat, Oslo Accords. My impression is that people hear these things a lot and don't really get what they're about. And there are other things like that, in the conflict, really. I think there's other things we could speak about. So if you found that useful, let us know, and maybe we could do another one of these.
Yes. This was a good discussion because I think it does clear up some of the basic concepts. Especially young people are so deeply confused about these days. They're not getting a proper education about it from their teachers, given the correct historical context. Yeah,
for sure. And even people who don't think of themselves as being particularly left wing or particularly on the side of Palestine, I think you find a lot of discussion around the conflict very confusing. One of my friends was visiting me recently, and very earnestly inquired in a kind of confused way about what my opinion was, and kind of asked, well, but don't you was asking me, well, don't you see this part of the Palestinian side of it, and so on. But I was being very earnest, just in the sense that I think because the conflict's gone on for so long and these things get brought up and people feel intimidated about asking for further clarification, he was genuinely confused and wanted to just ask a bit more. So I think explicating these things is useful. So let us know if you find them useful. Anything final to say, James, before we bring off?
No, but if you do find this kind of programming, you will get a point of view here that you probably won't get anywhere else. And if you do find this kind of programming of value, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center United Kingdom. We're doing something remarkable here. We're creating an international community of serious students of Ayn Rand's ideas, and we're applying them to every issue under the sun. So if you think this is important programming, please, at whatever level you can afford, consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center United Kingdom.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I don't believe we have anything else going on today after 7, but we'll be back tomorrow for the daily objective and the reality show as normal. Thank you so much for joining me, James. See you guys next week.
Thank you.